don't copy that yet. I know we haven't gotten to Connecticut. I think this is where we stopped? Somebody's going to have to remind me because I slept and I printed a new copy of the notes. Yeah. Okay. I didn't do anything over the weekend that even thought about school. Okay, so talking about New England in general, I think we pretty much got through this, that it was middle-class families, more merchants, sailors, fishermen, more women. It's a healthier area. Most of New England was settled by the Puritans, the Saints. A few years ago, a movie came out, Saints and Sinners, all about the first Plymouth or plantation, or the first one in Maryland, not Plymouth. They brought singers with them, kind of like in the South, in the Maryland, where Lord Calvert had his proprietary colony for the Catholics, but they brought in Protestants as servants. And I'm going to take this off. In New England, the few servants they brought with them weren't necessarily Puritans. They could be any other religion. Of course, they were going to do everything they could to convert them, but there weren't just Puritans there, but it was a Puritan-run society. And most of these New England colonies specifically set out with this divine purpose in mind to create a model society. It's going to be the beacon on the hill. They're going to create in this new world the church that they couldn't create in England. They're going to get rid of all of the Catholic and Anglican rituals. Everybody's going to behave. They're going to supervise each other in their religious faith. Laws and government are going to be based on biblical principles. And it's religion, while it's very strong everywhere, it's like it's on steroids in New England. For example, in 1650, Massachusetts had one minister for every 415 people, compared to one minister for every 3,239 in Virginia. You have a lot. Faith in the church is much, much more focused on in these New England colonies. And usually the church was the first building built. And the church bell kind of gave you your schedule for the day. As the church bell rang, you did the things you were supposed to do. So let's start talking about specific New England colonies. So here's our little map. And we're going to start with Plymouth out here, kind of work our way around. Plymouth is the first one. And it is one of the most uncompromising. It's made up of Puritans of the separatist group. These are the ones who had severed all ties with the Church of England. They were not interested in fixing the church any longer. They wanted to replace it. They had fled to Holland in 1607, but the Dutch, it was okay, but the Dutch were just too loose. The Dutch are actually, at this point, probably the most accommodating group in all of Europe. And they're going to be in the New World as well. The Dutch are going to, while Britain is settling the South and the North, that center part where New York is, that's being settled by the Dutch. And the Dutch don't care who comes, what they believe in. As long as they're there to make money and not cause trouble, they're welcome. So the Dutch were actually pretty cool as far as that goes. They were, you know, Jewish, sure, you can come. Catholic, sure, we have room for you. Atheist, yeah, it's okay. Atheists were kind of on the outs, but for the most part, as long as you didn't raise a fuss and you didn't cause problems, you were welcome. They were there for the money. They wanted to trade with the Indians, do a little farming, send stuff back across the ocean. That was cool. Not so cool in Plymouth. Plymouth was there for the church. So they head off to America. These pilgrims, and this is where we get the pilgrims, obtain a charter from the Virginia Company for a colony. Now remember, Virginia Company's way down here somewhere. They miss. They had planned to go to the South. They had planned to start a colony in Virginia. And in 1620, they cram 100 men, women, and children onto the Mayflower under the leadership of William Bradford, and they set sail. They miss Virginia entirely. They land up here. First, they land out here, kind of on Cape Cod. Then they move inward when they realize it might be a little bit safer. And they set up their colony. Now, like I mentioned, they had strangers. So only about 50 of those 100 aboard were saints. The others were strangers, hired hands, settlers, indentured servants. But now they're outside of any formal jurisdiction. They're outside of the area that the Virginia Company controls. They're kind of in no man's land. England has kind of laid claim to the whole East Coast, but no one's actually put foot on this area yet. So they decide to stay. And they decide that they're going to form their own government. There were 41 saints in the first agreement, and they agreed to live by laws of their own choosing. So let's go back to that, laws and government based on biblical principles. They write out what we know now as the Mayflower Compact on November 21st, 1620. It sets a precedent and an example for the other New England colonies that are going to come along. And it establishes this very American tradition for consensual government. Now, you've got to remember, at this point, nobody's thinking about Americans or America, other than that's the continent we're sailing for. These people are all still very British. Their ties are to Britain. If you ask somebody what their ethnicity is, what country are you from? I'm British. Even after 50 years of living in the colonies, they're going to say they're British. We're going to have to get up into the 1750s, 50s, 60s before people start thinking, hey, maybe I'm not so British after all. So at this point, this American idea, but it does start this tradition. And other colonies that are going to follow are going to kind of work on this. Because it's not like they land here and then they hide out. They start their colony, they go back to England for supplies. They have to say where they're at. And so the English government has, one, better claim, and two, knows what they're doing. So you get this government that's evolving out of a church government. And it works pretty well. They still have a lot of the same issues that any new colony starting out has. They don't have shelter, they don't have enough food, and half of them are going to die from either starvation, exposure, accidents, until they get help from the Indians. And the Indians in this area are the Wampanoag. This is where Squanto from your elementary Thanksgiving stories comes in. Squanto meets the colonists in the spring of 1620, shows them how to plant. Shows them that if you put fish in the hole with the seed, it's going to fertilize it, it's going to grow better. And their colony starts taking off. By autumn, they have a bumper crop of corn. They have a flourishing fur trade with the Indians. Let's go to the next one. And they're ready for the first Thanksgiving. This is when you get your first Thanksgiving. Thanksgivings have been a tradition for a long time. It's a long Thanksgiving, a long tradition among the Indians. It's also a European Thanksgiving. There's actually an earlier one in 1619 at the Berkeley Plantation in Virginia, but it doesn't get credited. It was probably not we would not recognize it as a Thanksgiving meal that we have today. They had cod, eel, clams, lobster, turkey, goose, crane, swan, partridge, eagle. That always blows my mind that they ate eagles, but I guess there's not a reason not to eat an eagle, except that it's a carnivore and it's kind of gross. But okay, so they ate eagles, venison, seal. Of course, they had corn. They'd grown corn. Pumpkins, peas, beans, onions, lettuce, radishes, carrots. And it wasn't just one day. It was a week-long celebration. The Indians were invited, just like you hear in the stories. But it wasn't quite the happy, we're all equal type of a thing. But it was a true Thanksgiving. I'm going to read a very long quote. You don't have to write this down. Our harvest, this is Edward Winslow, who was one of the leaders in the colony. Our harvest being gotten in, our government sent 4 men on fowling so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labor. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help besides, served the company almost a week. At which time, among other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest, their greatest King Massarat, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and they killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed upon our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it may not always be so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. He writes this in the Journal of Pilgrims at Plymouth in the history. So they're pretty successful pretty quickly compared to the Virginia colonies, but they also had the benefit of history. They saw what happened in the Virginia colonies and were a little bit better prepared. In 1623, they switched from a communal economy to more of an individual, with each male settler to provide from his family for his land, from his own land. Now you got to remember, they don't have a formal grant or a charter. They only have this Mayflower Compact, but it's working. So in a communal economy, everybody works the same piece of land together. You get your harvest. A lot of these New England colonies, when they switch from communal to individual, you'll have the town in the center, and then kind of around it you have houses. Like this is like your town hall. You'd have your church, store. Then around that you have houses. This is where people lived. Yeah, my squares are not all that great. It's okay. Then out from here, you have your farm fields. And they don't necessarily correspond directly, like it's not necessarily this guy has this field. Usually the higher up in the hierarchy, the closer your field is to the center, because they're going to keep going out. And you would travel out to your fields, but you'd live close into town for protection. And that's the way a lot of these New England towns end up being built. It's not this idea of one person living way out here by themselves, because you're vulnerable if you do that. So far the Indians have been friendly, but they saw what happened in Virginia. They don't always stay friendly. So, you want to have this communal area. It's also about this time that they decide to organize a general court. It's originally going to be the signers of the compact, but then more people are going to complain that, we're landowners, we're working, we're helping, we want to say too. So you get more freemen, which freemen means church members. And it eventually is going to evolve into a body of representatives from various towns, because Plymouth is not going to hold everybody. And you're going to start having little towns break off. Plymouth, as you might realize, we don't have a state called Plymouth. Plymouth is going to get absorbed into Massachusetts in 1691. It never really had more than 7,000 people total population. But it is the first, and it sets that example of church leadership, consensual government, self-rule. Massachusetts, however, we do have a state called Massachusetts, so it is one of the colonies that's going to last. And let's talk about it for a minute. And I know I'm going through these really quick, but that's the only way you can do a survey class, is to go through them very quickly. I feel like you need to know about them. So this one starts in 1629, and it starts with the charter from Charles I, who was the son of James I, who had been James VI when he was the King of Scotland. If you remember all of that, it begins as a business venture, but the majority of the people who are investors are Puritans. Now, these are not separatists. These are Congregationalists, sorry, wrong word. Congregationalists. They thought there was some saving, that you could save the Church of England. And they are under the leadership of a man named John Winthrop. Now, while they felt you could save the Church of England, they still want it done differently. So they're going to do it right when they get to the new colony. Winthrop was a 49-year-old man at this time. He had a floundering estate that couldn't support him and his 7 sons. He feared persecution because Charles was leaning Catholic. So he gets this set up. Going to go across the ocean, and we're going to start our new colony. It is a business venture, but it's also a new colony. And he takes advantage of an omission in the charter. When the charter is written up, there's no clause that requires the company headquarters to remain in England. That's been the clause, that's been the pattern with all of the other, with Calvert's, with the Virginia Company. You're required to have your business office in London, or at least in England. So what does Winthrop do? He loads the charter with him so they can't change it and takes it with him to the New World. Essentially, he is taking control with him. He has legal and total control over this new colony. I mean, there are some parameters. He still has to give everybody the rights of Englishmen and all of that. But legally, the colony is self-governing. You know, Plymouth was self-governing, but it was by accident. This is on purpose. So in 1630, 11 ships set sail for the New World. Winthrop was on one called the Arabella. He has 700 Puritans with him. And probably a number of non-Puritans. 200 are going to die in the crossing. And by the end of that year, 17 more ships are going to sail for this new colony. They're going to bring around another 1,000 colonists. Of course, again, not all of these are going to be saints. And this starts what's known as the Great Migration. People are leaving England in droves. Over the next 10 years, around 80,000 Britons are going to leave England. They're not all going to America. Most are, but they're also going to Ireland, the Netherlands, the Rhineland. Most are fleeing religious persecution or economic depression. Remember, we talked about the bones in the streets, the beggars and the enclosure movement. For the lower sorts, London wasn't a very happy place. You know, there weren't a lot of jobs. And this is still a time where you can be jailed for being in debt. So these new worlds offered new hope. They settle in Boston. They make that the main capital. And John Winthrop makes it the city on the hill. It is going to be the model city for not just this new world, but for everybody. They're going to show the world how a good Puritan society, i.e., the only society that we should have in the world, should be. You know, of course, it's very idealistic, and idealism never quite pans out the way they hope. But, you know, you got to have idealism. Now that they have their royal charter, and the charter is in Massachusetts, the power stays in Massachusetts. They set up a general court consisting of shareholders, freemen, church members. It's a small group to begin with. But like in every other group, like in Virginia, like in Plymouth, other people petitioned to be added. By the end of 1631, it's a group of 118 men, still only church members. By 1634, it's going to be a representative body with 2 to 3 people from each town, as little villages that broke off from Boston. Now they're probably all part of Boston as little suburbs, but you know. In 1644, it evolves into a 2-house legislature. So what starts out as a business venture ends up being a bicameral legislature or legislative run colony without ever changing the charter. And it's based on, again, biblical principle and a religious commonwealth. I mean, they build a religious commonwealth. And they're very proud of it. In fact, Boston is going to kind of lord over the rest of New England. And this next colony, Rhode Island, is an embarrassment to Boston. But and if you'll notice, there's this trend. Each colony kind of builds a little bit more on what the one before it did. You know, Plymouth established a religious community illegally. Winthrop does it legally. Rhode Island is going to be a little bit different. And one last thing about Massachusetts. Massachusetts is also going to be a staging area for a lot of these new colonies where religious differences come up. So Rhode Island will come out of some religious quarrels that start in Massachusetts. And they start with a man named Roger Williams, who arrives in Massachusetts in 1631. Roger Williams is a very devout Puritan. So devout, in fact, that he believes that covenants should be with God, between God and man, and not God and congregations, with the interceding of a minister. Because if a minister can talk to God, so can anybody else. And he will take this one step further. Pretty much believed the only pure church was between him and God. You know, everything else was tainted. Unlike Winthrop, he craved liberty over authority. Winthrop wanted order. And this idea is going to cause some clashes. So Williams is one of those men who makes that leap that if salvation depends on God's will, then who needs a church? It's all up to God. You don't really, and he's a minister. He had a church in Salem. Then he gets moved to Plymouth, goes back to Salem. But he asks too many questions. He starts questioning, why are we taking the Indians' land? Well, we're taking the Indians' land because the Indians' land is cleared and it's a whole lot easier than clearing our own land. But Williams is the first one who says, hey, that might be wrong. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that. Which is not what anybody else wanted to hear. He gets expelled from Salem. He's actually, this is in 1635, he's actually supposed to be banished to England, But Winthrop allows him to slip away with his family, and he goes to live among the Narragansett Indians in Narragansett Bay. So down here, and establishes the town of Providence. Providence is, and he established that is established in 1636. Providence is the first permanent settlement in Rhode Island. It was the first colony to allow freedom of religion. Kind of like the Dutch, they let anybody in, even the Jews. Williams actually went so far as to learn the Indians' language. It was, we would probably consider Providence more of a commune than a community, or well, commune is a community, more of a commune than a city. But it worked. He believed that the state had no right to coerce beliefs, so everybody could believe the way they wanted. In 1640, the settlers formed a confederation, and in 43, they secured their first charter to incorporate as Providence Plantations. Rogers is going to live until 1683, and in his lifetime, Providence Plantation lives up to his ideals. It's government based on the consent of the people. Another dissenter is a lady named Anne Hutchins. Now, so you even have dissenters in this, this, I won't say perfect, but close to perfect, or at least religiously free area. Anne Hutchins was the wife of a merchant, a healer, a midwife. She was a mother of 13. She led sermons in her home, or sermon meetings. They would meet after church to discuss the sermons. But she kind of went, at least by the standards of 1640s or 1630s, a little bit too far. One, she was a woman, and she was leading men and women in religious discussions. Church leadership to this point has been limited to men, and men don't want to give up that power. Next, she claims direct revelations from God. That's heresy, or at least blasphemy. She was convinced that most ministers were godless hypocrites, promoting covenants of works. So if you go back to that idea of predestination, there's nothing you can do to get yourself into heaven. But she said that's what ministers are telling you, that if you work hard, you're good, you do good things, you'll get into heaven. She eventually claims to know who is saved and who is damned. And they decide that, no, we really don't need you in the colony. You're causing too much problems. She wasn't an advocate for individualism, but she was threatening that we talked about church being a social construct and a social control. The ministers felt they had to prepare you for salvation by making you behave, because if you take that leap and you say that there's nothing on earth you can do to save yourself, then why do anything? Why behave a certain way if you're either saved or damned and it's nothing you can do to change it? Ministers don't want people making that leap. And really, Anne Hutchinson didn't either. She just wanted to be the one to tell you whether you were saved or damned. She's hauled before a court. She eventually condemns herself after 2 days of sparring. The judge gets so aggravated with her at one point that he says something along the lines of, "We didn't come here to argue with people of your sex. that just because she was a woman, she should shut up. But she eventually claims in courts to have direct revelation from God, which is heresy, and she's banished. She eventually will move to New York because the Dutch don't care, and is killed by Indians. But you have, and I bring her up to show that there is a lot of dissent and a lot of differing opinions. They leave England to set up these religious colonies where everybody's going to get along, but it never quite works out the way they want it. Now, Connecticut's the next colony. I will put a map on Blackboard. It'll probably be Friday afternoon before I can get to it, but I'll that shows all of the colonies so that you can get a better, we had that one little map, but get a better idea of where everything is. But Connecticut's the next one. So you had Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Connecticut is more inland from Massachusetts. And it's going to be settled by a group from Plymouth in 1633 on the Connecticut River Valley. Again, it's religious leaders who aren't happy where they're at. And a general comment, most of these people that come to the New World, most of these settlers tend to be movers. It takes a certain amount of courage to leave home. And especially you're leaving home and you're going someplace that you have no idea. But people that have that kind of a drive, that kind of a courage, tend to not stay put once they get to the new place. They tend to be a little more adventurous, and let's just keep moving on. So you're going to see this pattern of people, okay, we're going to land here, we're going to move in, we're going to move in a little farther. Not that people abandon the coastal areas, but the movement is going to keep going. So in 1636, Thomas Hooker leads 3 church congregations from Massachusetts to Weatherford, Windsor, and Hartford, sets up these new towns in Connecticut. They organize self-government, and by 1639, there's a general court that is going to adopt what they call the Fundamental Orders, which is a series of laws establishing a Christian commonwealth with voting extended beyond church membership. That's important. We have a colony now that is going to let people participate that aren't saints. You just have to be a landowner. The Congregational Church, the Puritan Church, was still the official church. It's supported by taxes and protected by the civil authorities. And the governor was to rule according to, quote, the word of God. But they're letting other people in, and they're letting other people participate in government, or other religions in. New Haven becomes the major settlement located on Long Island Sound. It is the most Puritan of the 3. And it's going to stay its own separate community until 1662, which in 1662, Connecticut receives a royal charter, and New Haven is included in it. But there's a little more evolving. You're getting a little bit more participation allowed, a little bit more liberal governments as you go on. All right, the next one, New Hampshire and Maine. Okay, so we've got Plymouth, that's going to be part of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, this little bitty spot, Connecticut, Maine and New Hampshire are going north. So most of what is New Hampshire and Maine was granted in 1622 as a proprietary colony to Sir Fernando George and Captain John Mason by the Council of New England. In 1629, the two divide the area at the Piscataqua River. Mason took the southern part, named it New Hampshire. George took the northern part, which is going to become Maine. They set it up and invite people to come. And in the 1630s, the Puritans start flooding in. This is, we've already started the Great Migration. You've got shiploads of people leaving Britain. The people that head for the New England colonies are, for the most part, able to take care of themselves. We talked about that earlier. It's families, it's merchants. Not everybody that's getting shipped out of England is. In 1638, the Reverend John Wheelwright, who was a follower of Anne Hutchins, establishes Exeter, New Hampshire. The New Hampshire area does better than Maine. There's more farming, there's more settlement. Maine is mostly fishing. There's a claim by Massachusetts that most of this area is actually theirs, but that's going to end up getting settled in court. The Massachusetts group wins sorry, let me think about I've lost my train of thought. It just went off the rails. The Massachusetts group is going to win during the English Civil War. And we have not talked about the English Civil War. And we will briefly, but I'm going to put a video on Blackboard that describes the English Civil War that you have to watch. There'll be an extra credit test that you can take for extra credit. You don't have to take it, but there will be something on the regular test off this video too, because I cannot explain the English Civil War. I just cannot wrap my brain around it. I've watched this video like 4 times and I still cannot wrap my brain around it enough to explain it to somebody. So I'll let this other guy explain it. So the Massachusetts will claim all the way up to the Merrimack River. They get it during the English Civil War. There's more lawsuits. And finally, in 1678, the English courts decide that no, the original proprietary settlement was right. It belongs to Ferdinand and John. And then the next year, New Hampshire, which is Mason's part, John Mason's part, becomes a royal colony. Massachusetts buys out Maine so they can keep control of it. But it is still a separate colony, at least for a while. If Maine is weird. Maine bounces back and forth, but will eventually become its own state. Okay. How upset would y'all be if we stopped a little bit early? Not upset at all? Okay, let's stop here because the next slide is the Indians. And I don't want to start that and have, only get through a little bit of it. Which one? Okay. That's okay. I think everybody does better in person anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as long as there's a seat, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Got it? You do know I put those on Blackboard too, right?
Yeah, I just, once I get home, I'm probably not gonna be wanting to do anything.
Probably not. I wouldn't.
My fiance even took off of work for Thursday and Friday so that he could take care of me.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Cause he knows I'm not gonna wanna get up and do